The data terminal in front of glowed with numbers that made no sense. He had spent 40 years as a senior analyst for the Galactic Coalition's Strategic Analysis Division, and in all that time, he had never seen anything like this. The division processed combat data from over 40,000 species across 12 million years of recorded warfare. Their predictive models were considered perfect. They were mathematical certainties that determined fleet deployments, resource allocation, and surrender protocols across all of known space. But these numbers were wrong. They had to be wrong. Leaned back in his chair, his three eyes blinking in sequence as he tried to understand what he was seeing. The siege of 442b had ended 2 standard rotations ago, and the final reports had just come in. A human garrison of 200 soldiers had been cut off from any reinforcement. They faced an assault force of 8,000 warriors. The models had predicted a 99.7% chance of surrender within the first rotation. Humans were soft creatures. They had no natural armor, no venomous spines, no ability to survive in vacuum. They should have given up immediately. Instead, the humans had held their position for 19 days. Pulled up the casualty reports and felt his stomach's turn. They had lost over 2,400 warriors, 12 times the number of human defenders. The last human soldier had died with an explosive device strapped to his chest, taking 17 with him. It made no sense. Flagged the data as an outlier and moved on to his other work. Outliers happened. Even the best models could not account for every variable. Perhaps the humans had received secret reinforcements. Perhaps the commander had made critical errors. There were always explanations for anomalies. 3 weeks later, the Battle of the Corridor proved him wrong. 43 human vessels, most of them small patrol craft with minimal weapons, encountered a combined armada of 600 warships from the Empire. The models predicted immediate retreat or destruction within hours. There was no logical reason for the humans to engage. They were outnumbered more than 14 to 1. Their ships were smaller, slower, and less armed. Every calculation showed that they should run. The humans did not run. The engagement lasted 11 days. When it ended, the humans had lost 31 ships and roughly 400 crew members. The Armada had lost 408 vessels and over 50,000 personnel. Stared at the numbers until his eyes hurt. He ran the calculations again and again, looking for errors in the data collection, mistakes in the reporting, anything that could explain what he was seeing. There were no errors. The data was accurate. The humans had won. Not just won. They had turned an impossible situation into a devastating victory, and when looked at the combat recordings, he saw something that chilled him to his core. The human pilots had not fought like desperate creatures trying to survive. They had fought like predators. They had attacked with a ferocity that seemed to increase as their numbers dwindled. When the last 12 human ships faced over 200 enemy vessels, they had charged directly into the heart of the formation. They had not tried to escape. They had not tried to surrender. They had accelerated to maximum speed and torn through the enemy fleet like a blade through flesh. Submitted a formal request for a full investigation. The division pulled data from every human engagement in the coalition's records. They analyzed the defensive station, where 80 human Marines had held off a Ani boarding party of over 1,000 for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. They studied this Hope Last Stand, where a civilian colony with no military training had fought a raiding force for 3 weeks using improvised weapons and homemade explosives. They examined the impossible breakout at Cygnus X1, where a single human cruiser with a damaged engine had fought through a blockade of 40 enemy ships and escaped into hyperspace. A pattern emerged, a pattern that everything the analysts understood about combat psychology. Every species in the coalition exhibited predictable stress responses when facing overwhelming odds. As enemy numbers increased, morale degraded. Unit cohesion fractured. At a certain point, surrender or flight became inevitable. The exact ratio varied by species, but the pattern was universal. The Ani broke at roughly 3-to-1 odds, the held until 5-to-1. The considered one of the most disciplined military species in the galaxy, typically surrendered when facing 7-to-1 odds or worse. Humans exhibited the opposite response. At even odds, human combat effectiveness was unremarkable. Their soldiers performed about as well as any other species with similar technology and training. At 2-to-1 odds, they showed a marginal increase in effectiveness. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise concerns. But as the odds grew worse, something strange happened. At 5-to-1, human units showed a significant spike in combat performance. They made fewer errors. Their coordination improved. They took more risks, but the risks were calculated, precise, effective. At 10-to-1, the spike became a surge. Human units fought with a ferocity that exceeded their baseline performance by 300%. They ignored wounds that should have been incapacitating. They continued fighting long past the point where any rational analysis said they should stop. At 50-to-1, the metrics broke the scale entirely. Presented his findings to the Strategic Council on a cold morning in the capital city. The council chamber was vast, filled with representatives from the 37 founding species of the coalition. They listened in silence as walked them through the data. He showed them charts and graphs and combat recordings. He explained the statistical analysis in detail, pointing out the confidence intervals and the methodology used to verify the results. When he finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment. Finally, High Counselor spoke. Her voice was calm, but could see the tension in her posture. She asked him to explain what was happening. She asked him to provide a reason for the anomaly. Admitted that he could not explain it. The data was clear, but the cause remained unknown. Human psychology operated in ways that the division did not understand. Their soldiers seemed to have a switch in their minds that activated when death seemed certain. Instead of accepting their fate, they fought harder. He had consulted with the divisions, but they had no explanation either. The behavior was unprecedented. It violated every known principle of survival instinct and evolutionary biology. When a creature faced certain death, it was supposed to conserve energy, submit, or flee. It was not supposed to become more dangerous. Another council member asked if this was a biological trait or a cultural one. Could it be bred out of them? Could it be trained away? Shook his head. The research was ongoing, but early indications suggested that it was both biological and cultural. Humans had developed this trait over millions of years of evolution on a world filled with predators, natural disasters, and scarce resources. They had then reinforced it through thousands of years of warfare against each other. The High Counselor asked what recommended. Took a deep breath. He recommended that the coalition immediately recalculate every strategic model involving human forces. He recommended that new protocols be developed for any military engagement with human populations. And he recommended, in the strongest possible terms, that no coalition species attempt to corner, surround, or trap human military units. The data showed that the worst thing you could do when fighting humans was to make them feel like they had no way out. He added one final observation before stepping down. The humans had a word for this behavior, this refusal to surrender when all hope was lost. They called it defiance, and based on the data, believed that defiance was the most dangerous weapon humanity possessed. The coalition authorized a full research initiative the following day. Combat historians and cultural analysts from 37 species would converge on Earth. They would study human warfare, human psychology, and human history. They would learn what made humans fight so hard when they had nothing left to lose. Watched the authorization go through and felt a strange unease settle in his chest. He had spent his entire career studying warfare, but he had never encountered anything like this. The humans were not stronger than other species. They were not smarter or faster or better equipped. They were simply unwilling to accept defeat. And that, realized, might be the most terrifying thing of all. The research team arrived on Earth 6 weeks after the Strategic Council authorized the initiative. Dr. Ani led the expedition, bringing with her over 200 specialists from 37 different species. They had been given unprecedented access to human military archives, combat recordings, and historical databases. Their mission was simple: understand why humans fought harder when they should give up. The answer, they quickly discovered, was anything but simple. Human history stretched back over 10,000 years of recorded warfare. Dr. Ani had studied military history from dozens of species, but she had never seen anything like the human record. It was of mathematically impossible victories, suicidal defenses, and last-ditch stands that should have ended in surrender, but instead ended in legend. The Battle of Thermopylae fascinated her. 300 warriors from a place called Sparta had held a narrow mountain pass against a Persian army that numbered over 100,000. The mathematics were absurd. The Spartans should have been overrun in minutes. Instead, they held for 3 days, killing so many enemy soldiers that the Persian king began to doubt the possibility of victory. The Spartans died, every single one of them. But they did not surrender. They did not run. They fought until the last man fell, and their sacrifice gave the rest of their nation time to prepare for the coming invasion. The humans had built monuments to these 300 warriors. They told stories about them. They made films and wrote books and named their children after the Spartan king who led them. Dr. Ani found herself disturbed by this. In coalition culture, defeat was defeat. There was no honor in losing. There was no glory in dying. But humans seemed to believe differently. They celebrated their losses almost as much as their victories, as long as the losses involved sufficient struggle against impossible odds. She continued her research, moving forward through human history. She studied the siege of a fortress called the Alamo, where fewer than 200 human fighters held off an army of thousands for 13 days. She examined the battle of a frozen forest called the Bulge, where surrounded soldiers refused to surrender despite having no hope of rescue. When an enemy general demanded their capitulation, the human commander had responded with a single word: nuts. The research team spent weeks trying to understand what that word meant in context. They eventually concluded that it was a form of defiant refusal, a way of expressing contempt for the very idea of surrender. Dr. Ani interviewed human veterans, soldiers who had fought in conflicts on other worlds. She asked them to explain what happened in their minds when they faced overwhelming odds. An old soldier named told her about something he called the shift. He had fought in the Battle of the Corridor, one of the engagements that had triggered the investigation. He described being on a small patrol craft when the enemy fleet appeared on their sensors. He remembered the moment when he realized how badly they were outnumbered. And then something changed. The fear did not disappear, he explained. It transformed. It became fuel. He stopped worrying about survival and started thinking about damage. He asked himself how many enemy ships he could take with him before he died. He asked himself how to make his death matter. Dr. Ani asked if this was a conscious choice or an automatic response. Thought about the question for a long time before answering. He said it was both. Humans trained for it, taught themselves to channel fear into aggression. But something deeper than training kicked in when death seemed certain. Something primal, something ancient. He called it the last stand instinct. The research team developed a theory based on their findings. Dr. Ani named it extinction response inversion. Most species, when facing certain death, conserved energy and sought survival through submission. Their biology prioritized living to fight another day. Humans, shaped by millions of years of evolution on a world filled with predators and disasters, had developed the opposite instinct. When survival seemed impossible, something in their neurology shifted. Fear transmuted into fury. The individual became willing to trade their life for maximum damage to the threat. It was not rational in the traditional sense. It did not improve their chances of survival, but it served a different purpose entirely. It made humans terrifying to hunt. On ancient Earth, predators had learned to avoid humans who fought back. A wounded human was more dangerous than a healthy one. A cornered human was the most dangerous of all. Over countless generations, this behavior had become embedded in the human genome. The instinct did not know the difference between a cave bear and an enemy soldier. It simply activated when escape became impossible. But biology was only part of the answer. Human culture had taken this instinct and amplified it beyond anything evolution could have produced. They had built entire mythologies around last stands and impossible victories. They taught their children to admire those who fought hardest when victory was least possible. They created words and phrases that glorified defiant resistance. Dr. Ani compiled a list of these phrases: do or die, backs against the wall, go down swinging, blaze of glory, over my dead body. The humans did not just tolerate last stands, they them. More troubling still was the social dimension of this behavior. Humans fighting alone exhibited the extinction response. Humans fighting in groups amplified it exponentially. The research team observed a phenomenon that veterans called unit cohesion under fire. When human soldiers faced death together, something happened between them that was almost telepathic. They stopped thinking of themselves as individuals. They became parts of a single organism, each cell willing to sacrifice itself to protect the whole. The worse the odds, the bond, the harder each individual fought. One veteran described it as loving the people next to you more than you loved your own life. He said it was the closest thing to a religious experience he had ever had. When death was coming and there was no way out, he felt connected to his fellow soldiers in a way that transcended language and thought. Dr. Ani submitted her preliminary findings to the Strategic Council after 4 months of research. The report was over 2,000 pages long, filled with data, analysis, and historical examples. But the conclusion was simple. Humans were not more dangerous because of their weapons or their technology or their numbers. They were more dangerous because of how they responded to fear. She included a warning at the end of the report. The data suggested that the worst possible tactical decision when fighting humans was to let them know they were surrounded. Other species became demoralized when they realized escape was impossible. Humans became something else entirely. They became the thing that other creatures feared in the dark. The Strategic Council received the report in silence. They studied it for 3 weeks before issuing new guidelines for coalition forces. The guidelines were detailed and specific, covering everything from engagement protocols to surrender acceptance procedures. But one recommendation stood above all others. It was printed in bold at the top of every document. When engaging human forces, never reveal the full extent of your numerical superiority. Never broadcast demands for surrender. Never attempt to demoralize through displays of overwhelming strength. The humans had a phrase for what happened when you tried to intimidate them with superior numbers. They called it motivation. 2 standard years after the research initiative concluded, the hegemony decided to teach humanity a lesson. The hegemony was one of the oldest military powers in the galaxy, an empire that had conquered over 300 worlds through sheer force of arms. Their warriors were massive creatures, standing over 3 meters tall and covered in natural armor that could deflect most projectile weapons. They had never lost a major engagement in over 2,000 years of continuous warfare. The human colony of New Brisbane had offended them. Some minor diplomatic insult, some perceived slight that the hegemony considered intolerable. The details did not matter. What mattered was that the hegemony wanted blood. They committed overwhelming force to the punitive expedition. 200,000 ground troops, supported by orbital bombardment platforms and a complete naval blockade of the entire star system. The colony's defense force numbered just under 4,000 soldiers, mostly reservists and local militia with minimal heavy equipment. The hegemony commanders had heard rumors about human combat behavior, but they dismissed these as exaggerations. They had fought countless species across the galaxy. They knew how war worked. Superior numbers meant victory. It was simple mathematics. On the first day of the siege, they broadcast a demand for immediate surrender. The transmission was designed to crush the colonists' morale. It showed sensor readings of every ship in the blockade. It displayed troop counts and equipment manifests. It made absolutely clear how outnumbered the defenders were. The hegemony wanted the humans to understand the hopelessness of their position. They wanted them to give up before any real fighting began. Colonel Sarah received the transmission in her command bunker beneath the capital city. She was a small woman by human standards, barely 1.5 meters tall, with gray hair and calm eyes. She had served in the coalition military for 30 years before retiring to New Brisbane with her family. She watched the enemy transmission with a blank expression. When it ended, she turned to her communications officer and asked him to open a channel. The hegemony commander accepted the connection, expecting surrender terms. Instead, he received 5 words that would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy. "You should have brought more." The siege began that afternoon. The hegemony expected the fighting to last perhaps 3 or 4 days. Their models predicted that the colonists would break once they started taking serious casualties. The mathematics were simple. The humans could not win. They could only delay the inevitable. The first assault wave hit the western perimeter at sunset. 3,000 hegemony warriors advanced in tight formation, their natural armor gleaming under the alien sun. They expected minimal resistance. What they found was hell. The colonists had spent the hours since the surrender demand preparing their defenses. They had mined the approaches, established overlapping fields of fire, and positioned their limited heavy weapons for maximum effect. When the hegemony warriors advanced, they walked into a killing ground. The first wave lost over 600 soldiers in the initial contact. The survivors fell back to regroup, stunned by the ferocity of the defense. They had expected fear. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they had found cold, calculated violence delivered with mechanical precision. The second wave hit at midnight, supported by orbital bombardment. The colonists had anticipated this. They had built their positions deep underground, with multiple redundant tunnels connecting key defensive points. The orbital strikes destroyed empty buildings while the defenders waited in safety below. When the hegemony warriors entered the shattered streets, the colonists emerged from their tunnels and attacked from every direction at once. The fighting lasted until dawn. When the sun rose over New Brisbane, over 2,000 hegemony soldiers lay dead in the streets. The colonists had lost less than 100. Day followed day. The hegemony commanders threw more troops at the defense, convinced that eventually the humans would break. They did not break. They bent, retreated, gave ground where necessary, but they never stopped fighting. Every block became a fortress. Every building became a death trap. Every street became a killing ground. Colonel moved constantly among her troops, appearing wherever the fighting was heaviest. She carried a rifle like any common soldier, fought in the trenches, and bled with her people. Her presence seemed to multiply the defenders' strength. When soldiers saw her walking through enemy fire without flinching, they found courage they did not know they possessed. By the end of the second week, the hegemony had lost over 30,000 troops. Their commanders began to show signs of uncertainty. This was not how war was supposed to work. The humans should have broken by now. The mathematics said they should have broken. The coalition's Strategic Analysis Division monitored the battle from their headquarters, updating their models with each new report. watched the data streams with a mixture of horror and fascination. Everything the research team had predicted was coming true. The humans were not just holding, they were fighting harder with each passing day. On the 23rd day of the siege, the hegemony launched their largest assault yet. 50,000 warriors attacked the colonial capital from all directions simultaneously. They breached the outer perimeter, fought through the secondary defenses, and pushed deep into the city center. Colonel ordered a fighting withdrawal to the final defensive line around the government complex. Her forces had dwindled to less than 2,000. They were low on ammunition, exhausted from weeks of constant combat, and facing an enemy that still outnumbered them more than 20 to 1. She gathered her officers in the basement of the Capitol building and asked for a status report. The news was grim. They had perhaps 3 days of supplies remaining. No reinforcements were coming. The blockade had held against every coalition attempt to break through. One of her captains asked if they should consider surrender. The question was not unreasonable. They had held far longer than anyone could have expected. They had inflicted casualties that would cripple the hegemony for years. Perhaps it was time to save what remained. Colonel considered the question carefully. Then she shook her head. She said that surrender was not an option, not because she wanted to die, but because she knew what would happen next. The hegemony did not take prisoners from species they considered inferior. Surrender meant death anyway. If they were going to die, she said, they were going to make it expensive. The next 2 weeks became legend. The defenders fought with a fury that shocked even the hegemony commanders. They attacked supply lines, ambushed reinforcement columns, and launched suicidal raids deep into enemy territory. Every night, teams of colonists slipped through the lines and caused havoc behind the front. On the 35th day, a squad of 12 volunteers attacked the enemy's primary ammunition depot. None of them survived, but the resulting explosion destroyed supplies meant to last another month. On the 37th day, Colonel personally led a counterattack that drove the hegemony back 3 kilometers and recaptured a critical water treatment facility. She took a plasma bolt through the shoulder during the fighting but refused evacuation until the facility was secure. On the 39th day, she died. It happened during another counterattack, this one aimed at breaking the hegemony's southern line. Colonel was leading from the front, as always, when an enemy sniper put a round through her chest. She fell in the middle of the street, surrounded by the soldiers who loved her. Her last words were simple. She told them to hold the line. She told them help was coming. Then she was gone. The news of her death spread through the colonial forces within hours. Some commanders might have worried that losing their leader would break the defenders' spirit. The opposite happened. The colonists fought with renewed ferocity. They attacked in waves, ignoring casualties, pushing forward through enemy fire as if death itself could not stop them. By dawn of the 40th day, the hegemony's southern line had collapsed entirely. On the 41st day, coalition reinforcements finally broke through the blockade. The relief force found a shattered city and a devastated enemy. The hegemony had lost over 63,000 ground troops and their orbital command ship. Their remaining forces were in full retreat, abandoning equipment and supplies in their desperate flight from the planet. The colonial defense force had been reduced to fewer than 300 soldiers. They were wounded, exhausted, and running on nothing but determination. But they were still fighting when the first coalition ships landed. The Strategic Analysis Division produced a full report on the siege of New Brisbane within 6 months. It became required reading at every military academy in the coalition. The report analyzed every phase of the battle, every tactical decision, every impossible moment where the humans should have broken but did not. At the end of the report, the division introduced a new classification for human military psychology. They called it Adversity-Positive Combat Response. It was the only such classification in existence. No other species in the Coalition's records had ever exhibited anything similar. The official doctrine that emerged from the analysis contained hundreds of specific recommendations for any force considering military action against human populations. It covered everything from initial engagement protocols to occupation guidelines. But one recommendation appeared at the very beginning, printed in bold text that could not be ignored. Never tell them the odds. The humans had a phrase for that too, the report noted. They called it tempting fate. The analysts were not entirely certain what fate was, but the data strongly suggested that it was something humans had learned to weaponize. In the years that followed, the siege of New Brisbane became one of the most studied military engagements in galactic history. Coalition species tried to understand how a force of 4,000 could inflict such devastating losses on an army of 200,000. They analyzed the tactics, the weapons, the terrain. They never quite grasped the truth. Humanity did not win the siege of New Brisbane through superior firepower or clever strategy. They won because they refused to admit they could lose. They won because every soldier, from colonel to the youngest recruit, believed in their hearts that surrender was worse than death. They won because when the universe told them they were beaten, they simply disagreed. The galaxy had finally learned what humans had known for thousands of years. There were worse things than dying. Giving up was one of them. And somewhere in the Strategic Analysis Division filed his final report on human combat behavior. He had spent years studying the data, interviewing veterans, and analyzing battles. He had developed theories and models and predictive algorithms. But in the end, he reduced his findings to a single sentence. When you corner a human, he wrote, you have not trapped them with you. They have trapped you with them. He marked the file as classified and hoped the Coalition would never forget the lesson. Some species were simply too stubborn to defeat.